Let's kickstart the second panel, and I would like to thank once more our distinguished panel members who joined us from, as I said a little bit earlier, from everywhere, actually. So, and we're going to talk about investments, and that's got to say, we didn't know where to start this one. It's really big. It's not overwhelming. That's the whole point, and there's nothing academics can't tackle. I'm pretty sure you all agree with me, distinguished members of the panel. But of course, you know, the days, I mean, I speak from a French experience, the days of large investments decided somewhere in an office, Rue Faubourg Saint-Honoré, with no cost consideration, are over, I think. Even now that EDF is going to be fully government controlled again, I'm pretty sure each and every taxpayer in France does understand that building power infrastructure takes a lot of money, means huge investments. You don't think about Flamanville only. And oh yeah, I forgot to say, I'm not mean-spirited, but in French we say j'ai mauvais esprit. But yes, that's true. So ultimately, you know, we have to take into consideration the yields. What would be an incentive for an investor? We even have to talk about profitability, which is not a swear word when you think of it. A lot of private companies are willing to invest in energy infrastructures, and we have to help them do that, because of course we do need power. So to speak with us today about this, we have Christian Gollier, whom I don't see Monsieur Gollier here. Well, yeah, Christian Gollier, you're here, from the Toulouse School of Economics. Joining us, Peter Hartley from Rice University in Houston. Hi there, all the way from Houston. I mean, this is something, or perhaps you're on the East Coast. I don't know where you are, but it's awfully early for you. Thank you very much, sir. And we have Anna Creti again. Thank you very much. Grazie mille, professore. We have David Newbery. Monsieur Hogan, we're not done with you, nor Mr. Glachon, and of course, Professor Dr. Andreas Löschel. Thank you very much for being here. Let me kickstart with the first question. Regarding investments, if I can find my question, actually, there's so many papers here. There it is. I wanted to start with you, Monsieur Gollier. You didn't get to speak earlier, but we would like to talk about technology, because we talk about wholesale prices, we talk about, but technology surely is going to help us as we're trying to look forward and find the right solution, the right pricing models, the right investment models, technological uncertainties yet, the timing of energy transition. I'm pretty sure you all followed the news about nuclear fusion, and already people got super excited, and I was amazed to see that a large general audience was made aware of the differences between fission and fusion, and the perhaps fantastic progress that was made very recently in the US. So, Professor Gollier, I would like you to discuss technology. We understand the two-market approach seems quite an option, depending on technological constraints. So I would like you to speak a little bit more about that, please.
Yes, I think we are now talking about the long term. And of course, most of the investment that will have to be performed for the energy transition are long-term investments. So it's clear that the large price of fossil fuels energies may help to decarbonize, but it's certainly not the long-term solution. Technologies are critically important, and the belief we have about whether this time again humanity will be saved by technology or not matter a lot to determine what's the speed, at what speed we should decarbonize our economy. Clearly, R&D, innovation will be important because it will be very hard to decarbonize the whole economy when using the current technology. Think about mobility, think about heating systems in residence and apartments and offices. Clearly, it will be very difficult to do that without big progresses that would reduce the cost of energy, of renewable energy in particular, and solving the storage, electricity storage problem. There are two schools of thought here. One is the growth movement, which believe that there will be no solution, no technological solution, and therefore we will have to do a lot, and the sooner the better, to decarbonize the economy, and probably at a large impact on purchasing power and forcing people to do a lot of sacrifices and very bad impact on GDP per capita. The other school is what we call the techno-optimist. You were just mentioning this nuclear fusion innovation that happened late last week in California. That's a great event. But who knows? Who knows whether these technologies will eventually emerge as something that is able to produce electricity fully decarbonized, of course, but at a relatively low price compared to the existing electricity mix today. So we don't know, and the consequence of the fact that we don't know what will happen even within the next 10 years force us to apply a kind of precautionary principle. Okay, of course, if we would be sure that those technologies will emerge sooner or later, we should rather wait, not doing too much, not asking too much to the current generation to pay for the transition. On the contrary, if we believe that the probability of this event is very small, we should do a lot immediately. We should not wait. And therefore, our beliefs about the speed at which we will perform those innovations in the green sector will be critically important. And of course, those probability distribution is not known, so we may have a debate on that. We need to apply a decision under uncertainty. We have to make choices today, and that implies that if we look on both sides of the Atlantic, we have numbers emerging about when we take into account those uncertainty, maybe we should implement, in particular for the electricity mix, we should implement all technologies today that cost less than 150 or 200 euros or dollars per ton of CO2 saved. So that's a lot more than what we have today in Europe. Keep in mind, we have electricity markets are covered by the ETS market, and the current price on this ETS market has been changing a lot these days, but it's around 85 euros per ton of CO2. So it's not enough to send the right signals of what should be done today and in the future to perform our ambition, in particular, being able to reduce emission by 55% by the year 2030 is quite of an impressive ambition. We'll stop at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gollier. So while we wait for technology to save the day, this nuclear fusion, by the way, is by 2100, I was told, if it bears fruition. I would like to speak to Professor Hartley and talk to you about what can we do. How can power producers obtain enough revenue to pay for investment costs? It's really, the incentives are extremely important. How do we get sufficient incentives for firm? How do we get incentives for power producers to produce or to invest, rather, sorry, to invest? Much, Professor.
Well, thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for including me in this conference. I would like, I guess, to begin by relating your question back to our previous discussion before the break, if I could. In this sense, that people were discussing, about whether we should have controls on gas prices, and the point was made that if you try to control the natural gas price, of course, it won't do very much to reduce demand. And part of the point of a high gas price is to send a signal that natural gas has now become much more valuable, and we want to send a signal to economize on its use. And then we were discussing the difference between also the marginal cost of generation for gas generators versus alternative potential suppliers. And people were making the point that with a very high natural gas price, the rent to low marginal cost suppliers, of course, goes up. And this was sort of talked about as, you know, to some extent, rent that's not, you know, we could capture and redistribute to consumers and so on. But of course, part of the point of that rent is it's sending a signal that the alternatives to natural gas generation that have lower marginal cost have become more valuable. And another way we economize, you know, the market is sending a signal to economize on the use of natural gas is to say, you know, that if we have alternative generating capacity that has a lower marginal cost, we want more of that. We want to invest in more of that. That's why the price differential is sending a signal for investment in this alternative capacity. And that, of course, if we do invest in that alternative capacity, that's another way of reducing the demand for natural gas. Now, you might say, well, people who've invested in low marginal cost capacity in the past didn't anticipate this particular outcome right now. And so in that sense, they, you know, those people are earning rents. And of course, there's a long history of this way of thinking about energy markets, you know, not just electricity markets, but more generally, we might want to think about, you know, new supply versus old supply. And, you know, people will say, yes, well, we want to send a signal to any new entrants that have low marginal cost, that is now, their capacity is now more valuable because it would enable us to displace natural gas generation and so on. But there's no point sending a signal to the old producers who've already invested in that capacity in the past. And of course, the problem with thinking about things that way always is that you know, a lot of the producers that are making investments anticipate periods of higher prices in the future to cover situations where, you know, the current price is not covering their average costs. And so if governments start to always intervene only when prices are high, of course, it's going to affect incentives to invest, right? So so the discussion we had earlier about rents and marginal cost of gas generation versus the alternatives and so on, I think are relevant, very relevant to our discussion of investment. The other aspect of your question in terms of getting incentives to invest, I think if we start to think about the long run, so moving away just from the immediate crisis, but thinking about the long run, if you're thinking about a long run system where you have all of the marginal cost, all of generation has zero marginal cost, how do we send the right, how do we in that situation send the right incentives to invest? Of course, in the current kind of situation where you have some generation with high marginal cost, it's that difference in marginal cost that provides the incentive to invest. But if all the generation is zero marginal cost, we're back in a world where we have to recover really all the costs of this investment, the fixed costs, through some alternative mechanism. And I think that brings us back to our discussion also in the first session, you know, of long-term contracts and other kinds of pricing mechanisms that will give the incentives to provide investment when marginal costs, you know, are zero.
Thank you very much. Professor Hogan, it seems the traditional market design, you know, marginal pricing framework is under attack, and notably when renewable account for a large part of power production. So do you think we will have to depart significantly, forgive me, from it? Or should we accept that some producers will disappear from the market?
Well, I think the panelists have already generally spoken about the importance of the marginal signals, both for short-run efficiency and for, as Peter was just describing, the long-run story. And people are going to enter the market and people are going to leave the market. I don't have strong views of who should do what about that. I'm more interested in that the prices reflect the real opportunity costs, and then I'm happy with their choices, and as opposed to trying to prevent it. I would say there are real, as with all these things, real complications when you try to deviate from those fundamental principles I described before. Peter talked about the inframarginal rents. In the United States, before we dealt with the restructuring of the electricity markets, we had to face the problem of oil and gas, and particularly natural gas. And we had old gas and new gas and new gas and deep new gas and interstate versus intrastate gas and so on. We were trying to find all kinds of ways to strip away the rents that we're talking about here, some of them quite expensive. This system did not work, and it led to natural gas shortages and curtailments of industry because we couldn't curtail us homeowners in New England. So I had priority, but the industry was curtailed. It was just a mess. And then we finally threw our hands up and said, we're just going to get rid of the whole system. And so we went to market pricing for everything. And the problems went away almost immediately. And that was before the surprise, the technological surprise that Christian was talking about of fracking and the new development of natural gas, where the problem wasn't that we had a shortage of natural gas, the problem is we had too much natural gas, which is where we are today. So I think it is a very powerful argument for markets and getting the price signals in and keeping out of the business of trying to transfer rents through all these things. I know that's politically unappealing, and I'm prepared to talk about it more, but I think the experience is pretty compelling.
Thank you very much. So remember, the purpose here is to actually foster, to be part of a debate at the EU level. And if there's something that the EU loves is taxonomy. And I would like to turn to Professor Visconti. We know it's at the heart of the EU debate when it comes to investing in power production infrastructure. So how best, in that respect, to funnel financing? What is green? What is not green? Is nuclear green, for that matter?
Well, here comes the EU taxonomy. The EU taxonomy is a classification system establishing a list of environmentally sustainable economic activities. The scope of the taxonomy is to provide companies, investors, and policymakers with appropriate criteria, very specific and technical in some cases, to define economic activities as environmentally sustainable. So the taxonomy was born to canalize investment exactly in the sustainable direction, avoiding greenwashing. But this application will reduce the number of technologies in favor of the best performing ones in terms of the green transition. So the design or redesign of future low carbon electricity market, we were talking before on this, should take the number of taxonomy compliant technologies as a constraint, with possible effects ranging from capacity markets to day-ahead market and real-time session. The taxonomy, following the taxonomy, an activity must be eligible, it must meet the technical screening criteria, and and they do not significant harm criteria. And nowadays, the taxonomy is still a work in progress. We had the regulation in 2020, then in 2021, the EU's Climate Delegated Act with the two climate objectives considered, and then a complementary delegated act for gas and nuclear activity in 2022. Gas and nuclear are considered eligible but transitory activities. And in the regulation, there is the list of eligible activities, so I'm talking about the regulation, are mostly renewable, 23%. Then we have a group of technology we have to meet some specific emission limits, and then a fourth group we have to satisfy a list of very articulated criteria to be eligible. And coming to the complementary and climate delegated act about nuclear and gas, they are put in the transitional category. And what we mean for transitional, these are activities that cannot be replaced now since they don't have a low carbon alternative, which is technologically and economically feasible. But they do contribute to climate change mitigation and may play a major role in the transition to a climate neutral economy. They, moreover, are subject to very strict conditions. For example, for nuclear activity, many cases are considered technologies at the pre-commercial stage, electricity generation from nuclear existing installation, modification and upgrades. For modification and upgrades and for new nuclear power plant projects, there is a sunset clause. In particular, new nuclear power plant of the generation third plus, let's say, will be recognized until 2045. This is the date of approval of the construction permit. And moreover, the technical screening criteria for nuclear energy are very strict if compared with the current legislation. And these criteria consider both low-level waste and high-level radioactive waste with different regulation. For example, the technical screening criteria prohibit the export of radioactive waste disposal in third countries. So this won't be allowed anymore. Coming to natural gas activity, is considered electricity generation, cogeneration, and efficient district heating and cooling systems. And the role of natural gas-fired plants will change over time, and they will become increasingly facilitators for the spread of renewable electricity and stable supply. All installations using fossil gas shall switch fully to renewable or low-carbon gases by the end of 2035. So there is a sunset clause on this. So to conclude, the aim is to substitute coal and all gas-fired plants with more efficient gas installation with a credible path toward the renewable gas. So when reasoning about the future of electricity market, we have to keep in mind the boosting effect of the taxonomy towards investment in this new technology. So I believe that we have to take as a constraint the list of eligible technologies and the list of transitional activities considered in the taxonomy. So the market design should promote the transition towards a taxonomy compliant industry structure.
Thank you very much. when it comes to actually investing in power production that is not renewable, there might be another solution. Professor Newbery, would you mind talking to us about capacity markets? Do you think they are the answer? And what are the limits? Because I suspect they are. Thank you.
Well, I think there's considerable agreement that we're moving towards a hybrid market solution, where you have competition for the market through auctions, and then competition of the technologies that have been selected in the market to determine which are dispatched. And that's where all the short-term price signals come in. But the competition for the market, I think you can distinguish several categories of investment. Renewables, wind and solar, we already have annual or biannual auctions in which we specify how much capacity we want or how much money we're willing to spend. And those have been very successful in driving down the cost, particularly of offshore wind. It's now coming in competitively with, almost competitively with onshore wind, which regrettably GB has ruled out. When it comes to nuclear power, as I said, we consider that to be an important long-term element of the portfolio, reliable, dispatchable. But again, the regulatory asset-based model, since basically speaking there are not enough competitive suppliers to imagine running an auction, is a viable option. And critically, in both cases, I would stress the importance of reducing risk in the perception of the investors. And it's worth noting, in Europe, perhaps not so much where Bill Hogan lives, that much of the risk is purely political. The rules of the game keep changing. What is considered an eligible investment, maybe gas one day and not the next, nuclear in one country, not in another, and how much support goes to renewables varies, and of course has a big influence on future prices. So the only person or the only entity that can offer insurance against its own perfidious unreliability is the government through some credible counterparty, which is eventually, after much consideration of all the alternatives, is what the British government has been forced to accept. Now that leaves the need for controllable and typically fossil-generated flexible plant, which will be increasingly needed, but will probably run a decreasing amount of the time. As we get sufficiently large quantities of renewables, probably the load factor on these plants will become very low. And I think that has to be credibly forecast, and probably the investors themselves know that. And so they need some assurance of being able to make up the missing money, the capital cost, which the market cannot reliably deliver. And either a capacity auctions we have in Britain or an option auction which they have in the island of Ireland looks to be the least unsatisfactory solution to that, and seems to have worked quite well where it's been tried. And I'm sure Bill can comment on capacity auctions in the States, where the price caps are rather lower than they are on the continent. So the key message is long-term contracts which reduce risk but will still provide the necessary short-term price signals to operate, particularly the flexible plant we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Newbery. Mr. Hogan, capacities in the US.
I emphasize that I'm speaking on behalf of Bill Hogan only on this particular topic. This is a long discussion, but my view of capacity markets, at least as the way we've characterized them in the United States, is the original sin of market design. And it's created problem after problem after problem. As a matter of fact, it's exhausted the system operators and the regulators trying to fix the problems of the capacity market, and they can't pay attention to anything that actually matters. So I think it's just a mistake. And I'm happy to go into it at length. There are alternatives that are available. The Texas approach with the operating reserve demand curve is the most prominent one, which you can be conservative. I can explain why that's important. But the fundamental problem of capacity markets is we don't know, actually we don't care about capacity. We care about energy. And then we get into the question is this plant going to be able to deliver under stress conditions in order to meet the needs of the customers and so on? And that is basically a question we don't know how to answer. If we actually knew how to answer that question, Enron would have been right. We wouldn't have system operators, TSOs, and we would have just a bilateral trading market was handling all the physical scheduling of everything. But we don't know how to do that. So capacity markets have been very successful at sending checks to people. So there's a lot of money that's been transferred through them. Whether or not they have been successful in actually solving any problem about reliability or operations in the system is, in my view, at best an open question. And so you go back and you look, for example, at the postmortems of the Texas crisis last year, and the question is, Peter can comment on this, probably knows more about it than I do, but would a capacity market have made a difference as designed in the United States? And my view is no. So it just wouldn't solve that problem. And if you look at the recent economic analysis of various kinds of capacity market options, and you read through the descriptions of what they're doing, and you have to get to, I was talking last week about this, you get to page 93 of the report before you see the caveat that, well, this report doesn't deal with the conditions that existed in Texas in February of 2021. So we'll set that aside, and now we'll have to decide on how to have a capacity market. And you think about that, and you say, what are we talking about here? So I've always refused to work on capacity markets because I think it's a distraction, a waste of time, and I don't know how to do it. That's been true for now decades, and I've been consistent in my position on that. So you asked the wrong person.
Thank you very much. Before I put the question to Professor Hartley and Professor Glachant, I would like to put it to you. And you will have to raise your hand. Minus you, Chairwoman Vargon, please. Who thinks markets are best to stimulate investment in your capacities? Raise your hand. Levez la main, s'il vous plaît, si vous pensez que ce sont les marchés qui peuvent stimuler. Pardon?
Please raise your hand if you think that the markets are the best place to stimulate investment.
Which markets? We have so many markets.
We have so many markets. Yes, 2 minutes, Professor Glachant. The audience first. Governments are the best to foster new investments in government policies. And there's a lot of people who don't know. Including me. Thank you very, very much. So I'm not sure, Professor Hartley and Professor Glachant, if you saw that, but the question is actually, does the market fare well at stimulating investments in new capacities? It looks like actually government policies are actually triggering them. So first perhaps Professor Glachant and then second Professor Hartley.
I will not answer. I will quote Paul Joskao from MIT. Paul said, what are we doing since a few years? We are pushing decarbonization, decarbonization, decarbonization. How can any market continuously foresee how much this will be pushed by a public agenda, a public policy, and respond to it? And David is just a bit more astute. David is saying, but every year or every semester, we open an auction and people will answer. But if you if you add all these answers made in the past, today, and in the future, are all these answers answering the question? Me.
Hartley.
Okay, so I would like to, I guess, I'll make a little comment, first of all, on what Bill was saying about the Texas
Professor.
incident, because I think the main conclusion from all that is that the operating reserve demand curve is not really the problem. I think the major there were a number of problems. These events in Texas are not unprecedented. It's happened in the past. We've had these freeze events, but they're very infrequent. And of course, the implication of that is for a lot of producers, it's not really worth their while investing to guard against these very low probability extreme events. But the main single problem, I think, in the Texas incident really was that it turns out that a lot of the gas compressors on the pipelines and the storage facilities were converted to run off mains electricity, rather than, what they had formerly done was use the gas in the pipelines or in storage to run the compressors. They converted to run off the grid, partly as a matter of cost, particularly with a lot of wind in Texas. A lot of times you had a marginal price of electricity which was lower than the opportunity cost of using the gas, but also partly because of environmental reasons. The idea was, instead of using gas to run the natural gas compressor stations and so forth, you use electricity, with a lot of it made by renewables. But the problem was that these gas compressors were not declared essential facilities. So when there was a reduction in wholesale power supply initially as a result of the wind turbines freezing, and then was okay when people were cut off according to contract, right, according to their interruptibility contracts and so on. But when we got to the position where you had to black out users, some of the gas facilities were blacked out because they hadn't been declared as essential facilities. Then the gas pressure in the pipelines fell, which meant that more gas generators had difficulty generating at full capacity, and we're in this sort of downward spiral, essentially. And following the incident, one of the big changes was a lot of these gas facilities have now been declared essential facilities, so they won't be cut off. It is true in Texas that there's an enormous amount of gas capacity that serves as backup, but and I think that and some of that gets paid according to the operating reserve demand curve payments. And I think most people have concluded that probably there would have been enough capacity if it hadn't been for this particular unfortunate feedback loop. But I want to get back to the issue of investment in capacity and make a comment on also this classification of different types of generators, according to their greenness and so on and so forth. And make the point that, and this relates to your question about markets and investment, but here we're talking about investment in different types of capacity, that, it's a long-standing principle in environmental economics that, rather than using command and control, where the government specifies certain kinds of technologies for environmental reasons and so on, that it's much more efficient to use a market where we have, either a tax on emissions, or we have marketable permits, and then you allow those to determine, via market mechanism, the kinds of investments you make, rather than trying to specify we ought to invest in this or that or something else. And this applies across the board to all sorts of environmental issues, not just this one we're talking about in the electricity market. And I think there's a lot of evidence that using those kinds of market mechanisms in the environmental context also is a much more satisfactory outcome than governments trying to pick particular technologies as being winners. And indeed, there's another issue on all this too, again, short run versus long run. what is the best alternative, or what might appear to be the best alternative to fossil fuel generation right now, is not necessarily what's going to be the best alternative in the long run, going back to the earlier discussion about new technologies and so forth. And sometimes, you know, if you specify certain technologies, they look like the best alternative right now, but they may not necessarily be the best long run. In fact, putting in these alternatives may compromise the competitiveness of what might be best in the long run. I'm thinking here, types of nuclear may not be very compatible with renewable energy that is very intermittent, because you don't have the same demand for baseload, and a lot of the nuclear is much more economic if it's able to supply a bigger amount of baseload power. So encouraging a lot of intermittent generation in the short run may not necessarily be compatible with the long run solution. So that's just one example, but my more general point is I think a lot of these things are much better left to markets, including markets for environmental externalities, rather than trying to pick winners and choose particular technologies.
Thank you very much. Dr. Löschel, you wanted to react. How best, and my question is to you, this is the same to everyone. I mean, how best to foster power investments? I mean, what are the best investment incentives to you?
Well, I think we heard from the discussion that on the one hand, we have the renewables. On the other hand, we have the question on how we are looking at secured capacity. And concerning the renewables, I would say that that also in the medium run, we will still see relatively high prices on the wholesale markets. So why? Because, of course, even if we have large shares of renewables, there will be other technologies that will set prices. And this is not necessarily only gas power plants, but that could as well be electrolyzers or whoever is there, demand. I mean, there will be high prices, okay? So for the renewables, I think we have more better perspectives, including, of course, the role of CO2 pricing, for example, that can help us to secure that. Then, of course, the question is, as we have heard from Professor Newbery, what about the risks? Then, of course, you can think about how to reduce these risks in Germany, we have one-sided market premia. You can have contracts for difference in order to accelerate this build out. I think the other thing is really how do we go ahead with the secured capacity and the issue of security of supply. And there, I think we know that we need a lot of new investments in the future in order to accompany the renewables build out. And these investments, they of course would rely on very high prices to come along. And we have heard that these at the moment seems to be relatively unrealistic. And I have to say the developments of the last month have probably as well not really assured investors that policymakers are willing to accept high prices, because that's of course one of the things that you have to make sure that you're accepting high prices as well in order to provide payoff for this investment. And then what are the other opportunities? And I think Professor Hogan already made some very good comments on the capacity markets. Then, because if we move to the capacity markets discussion, then we are facing immediately a lot of problems. The one that was a bit discussed about the in the innovation space. I mean, what's the time span we are talking about? The investors, they would like to have 30 years. We would like, policymakers would like to have 1 year. And where do you settle, in order to find the right balance? The other one will be how do you do that European? I mean, there are a lot of mechanisms already in place in many different markets. So what would be a European solution to this? And the third one, I think, which is really crucial, is you would have to include other flexibilities, because we heard that we don't care about capacity. We care how we are actually satisfying the load that is there, and we would have to include other options as well. That would mean we would have to include demand, storage. We would all have to bring this in. It's not only about gas or in the future hydrogen power plants. No, it's all these options. And how do you make them comparable in these markets? I think that will be really, really tricky. And I think you are probably more likely to fail than to find a good system that is actually achieving your goals.
Thank you. Professor Gollier, I think you wanted to react, and then Professor Visconti, if I got the order right, that is. Monsieur
No,
Gollier.
in fact, Lucia was before me, but very quickly. So on the taxonomy, I fully agree with Peter. I mean, we have two instruments for one objective, which is not a good idea, the objective of reducing emission. The carbon pricing mechanism is the right solution, and the taxonomy is the second best solution. It's even a third best solution if in the taxonomy we don't do the cost-benefit analysis of the measurement of the relative merit of the different technologies, and look at what happened in the debate about whether nuclear or natural gas should be labeled green in the taxonomy. At the end of the day, it was not a cost-benefit analysis, it was just a political negotiation between France and Germany. So I don't feel taxonomy is the right thing to do. In particular, for example, determining that natural gas is green before 2035 and will become brown in 2036. Who knows? Of course, who knows? So the carbon pricing will do the job. If the carbon price is large enough, natural gas will naturally disappear from the electricity mix at the time where we will find technologies that provide electricity at the cheaper cost, including the carbon price. I wanted to say one additional thing which is related to that. I think among economists we spend much time and energy determining whether a carbon tax would be better than a market for permits. The advantage of a tax is that you can establish a price, and you can say today for the next 10 years we will have the price, that price growing at carbon price growing at that given minimum rate. For ETS market, for permits, we put on the shoulder of the suppliers of energy a very large will be in 2035, and there are reasons why this is uncertain. At the same time, in order to trigger the energy transition, we need to provide more. I mean, we need to reduce uncertainty, and so that's why Jean Tirole and myself, for example, we try to promote the idea to have on the EU ETS market a minimum floor, a price floor for carbon growing at a given minimum growth rate every year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Gollier. Madame Visconti.
Well, I would like to go back to the issue of capacity markets and to tell you the Italian story. Starting from 2015, we observed a very large increase in the balancing cost. And the regulator started to analyze this issue. And more or less at the same time, the biggest Italian producer announced that it will close 23 generating units characterized by flexibility. So mostly gas plants, even very young gas plants of the last generation. And this put a concern. And why? What was the motivation of this? The motivation was insufficient profits. Why? Because we had a strong introduction of renewables in our market. The price decreased not a lot, but many conventional units were pushed outside the merit order. That's why they were not operating, and they started to make very large profits. Maybe there was a sort of strategic interaction between them, and this was the very reason why cost increased. At that time, I think a political issue started to be discussed, and at the end of this, due to the concern about system security and this idea of shutting down such a number of flexible generating units, that we started to think about a capacity market. So sometimes the capacity market in a way is a bit forced to make some operators, conventional operators, to recover money lost in the day-ahead market and to guarantee the survival of this kind of unit. This was briefly the Italian story about capacity market.
Si. Madame Creti.
Yes, thanks. Just fact-checking on where we are. So in Europe, we did invest, and we reached the 2020 targets, so France will surely catch up. We have used a lot of instruments so far, mainly based on the idea of subsidizing renewables in different ways, feed-in tariffs, feed-in premia, contracts. So I'm going back to this issue as well. The point is that now we have to, so we were on the bicycle, and then now we have the bicycle, but we have to go on the mountain. So we have to decide whether we continue on this bicycle or we change, maybe something, an electric vehicle to go up the mountain and the challenge of investing. So who has paid this investment? Mainly, through the subsidies. It means that as consumers, we all have paid, but at the same time, we didn't pay a very high CO2 price. So all in all, I think that the cost efficiency of what we have done so far may be more or less good. The problem is that we didn't phase out fast enough the fossil generation. So there is an asymmetry in what we have done with respect to also the objective, because one thing is to have renewable capacity, the other thing is whether it can really substitute the fossil fuel generation, and under which conditions. So maybe the taxonomy will raise the cost of capital of the fossil fuel generation and be complementary to the CO2 prices. So what we have now, which is the objective and which is the horizon, to accelerate, and also what Repower EU says. And that's why I was using this metaphor. So should we change the way in which we conceive the investment incentives? We have an array of possibilities that, of course, during the also this working group we have to discuss. And one of these options is to use more intensively long-term contracts under the form of contract for differences. Those contracts for differences already exist. It's not new. As well as it was also recalled by the ministry, power purchase agreements, which are kind of a specific form of contract for differences. The question is, do we have to generalize them? Because for the moment, they have been used for renewables. The example, as also Professor Newbery was saying, is the most prominent example is UK, with an auction to enter contract for differences. France is also using them for wind power generation. So it's something that we have to work with more intensively for renewables, or we have also to de-risk all the kind of investment in different technologies by using contract for differences. The point is that in theory, this is going to reduce the risk and therefore increase the incentive for investment. But in practice, there are many things that we don't know. That is, how do we have to fix the reference price and the strike price if we want to compare solar, wind, and storage and hydrogen, which is depending on the deployment rate of those technologies in the different European countries. Should we have all the same strike price and reference price? Are we facing the same risk depending exactly on the deployment of these renewables in the different European countries? So these are very important questions, and I don't think that the long-term contracts under the form of contract for differences are a silver bullet. Another form that we may want to consider in the options on the renewable investment dilemma is the carbon contract for differences, in which we take only a specific part of the cost, that is the variable costs that are related to the by how much we avoid CO2 emissions. So those contracts are just entering the kind of instrument, the set of instruments that we have, especially for the sectors that are deep to decarbonize, and especially for some technologies that, as hydrogen, still have very high cost. So the idea of contract for differences, I'm sure that we are going to deliver something in this working group. But again, yes, they can be used, but the way in which they will be generalized, we need to standardize them, because we have an issue that is still European, and then we have to consider the way in which they offer these also accountability in the long term, in order to have at the same time all the countries the same incentive for investment. If not, we will have laggards and leaders, and this is something that we want to avoid, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor Creti. I know you need to leave at 4:50, so don't hesitate when you need to leave. But I would like actually to a follow-up question about the contract for differences that you mentioned. And I would like to ask to Professor Harry and perhaps Professor Glashon what they think of it.
Well, I've been arguing for a small modification for the contract for difference with feed-in tariff that we have for wind and solar. Those are extremely good at hedging the revenue risk, because if you can predict, and you usually can, on average how much you're going to produce, and you know the price, then you know the revenue, because the variable costs are very low, and you can go to the bank and finance that with debt. Now, there are two problems with that. The first is that you only get paid the strike price, the auction strike price, if you generate. And so you're motivated to generate when perhaps you shouldn't. And perhaps you should be offering turn-down services or other forms of ancillary service. So a standard contract for difference in a conventional generator is purely financial. You just say how many megawatts you want to hedge, and then regardless of the actual market conditions, you get paid that, or you pay the difference with that in the market price, but you use the market price to guide your output decisions. So the problem is you can't say in advance exactly how much megawatts a wind power plant will do or months ahead, but you could do a forecast one in which you say the day-ahead forecast of the capacity factor will be the amount to which you're hedged. And that way, it's again a purely financial contract, and you will look at the spot market and the balancing market and the ancillary service markets and decide what it's actually practical to do. That's probably even more important with flexible resources like batteries. Another part of that is, at the moment, we offer 15-year contracts. I would suggest replacing that with a certain number of full operating hours. So you could say you get 40,000 megawatt hours per megawatt of capacity, and that means you can decide quite happily if the prices are very low and you can avoid some maintenance costs not to operate, and you don't lose that megawatt hour of guaranteed revenue. The 40,000 megawatt hours will also mean that you can go to the bank and say exactly how much money you're going to get. You don't have to worry about curtailment. And it creams off the inframarginal rent from the high resource areas. So very small tweak, which you could offer in the next year auction for renewables, would, I think, make them more market responsive, would provide the revenue security to guarantee a very low cost of finance, and would also avoid inframarginal rents. So that's how I would deal with one part of the story. I'll leave others to jump in and say what other forms of contracts we might usefully have.
Thank you very much. Professor Glachant.
My knowledge about it is coming from David, and the David I understand. It's not the true David that you have heard. And two words are key. CFDs are uniform, long-term frames.
Much.
My God, we know little about the future, and we know that the future is not uniform. Second, there are financial protections. Oh my God. But we would like to know about the system value of the use of CFDs. And Christian will say, no, we would like to know also the social value of it, because there are tools to decarbonize, but we do not say anything about the social value of decarbonization they deliver. So many things have to be looked at, thought, discussed. Anna said it a minute ago, and in her generation, you also have Natalia Fabra saying that CFDs, we need to work more on it, and also young German, Lion Hirt, saying CFDs, okay, it's a word, but we have to work much more on it. That's the only thing I know about that.
Thank you very much. That's the end of our second panel. Please, let's a round of applause for Professor Creti, who has to leave, unfortunately. She said she talked too much already. I'm not sure, actually, but thank you very much. And 5 more minutes of pause, of break, if you want, if you will. And when we come back, we are going to discuss about you, about us, about the general public, about consumers. Thank you very much. See you in 5 minutes.